So on behalf of Crossroads Cultural Center, I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight. It's a very special occasion for us. We have here volunteers from Washington, D.C., Houston, Denver, Austin, and Los Angeles, as well as several members of our advisory board. Tonight, after 10 years and more than 250 public events around the United States, we'd like to express our gratitude to all who made this journey possible. But we also feel the need to renew our first love, which made us begin and continue this journey until now. And there's no better way for renewing this first love than to remember, or better, to listen again through various witnesses to the man who was the soul and mind of our cultural center, Monsignor Lorenzo Albacete. I'd like to read a letter that we received from the Apostolic Nuncio in the United States, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano. To the participants in the 10th anniversary of Crossroads Cultural Center, as the personal representative of our Holy Father, Pope Francis, to the United States of America, I am pleased to convey to all of you the spiritual communion of His Holiness. As you celebrate this evening in memory of Monsignor Lorenzo Albacete, may you delight in the memory of a man who enriched the culture by helping people in various walks of life to encounter Christ in the human experience. Monsignor Albacete fostered this encounter in a way that anticipated the apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, in which Pope Francis said, "Proclaiming the gospel message to different cultures also involves proclaiming it to professional, scientific, and academic circles. This means an encounter between faith, reason, and the sciences, with a view to developing new approaches and arguments on the issue of credibility, a creative apologetics, which would encourage greater openness to the gospel on the part of all." Commending Monsignor Albacete to the loving arms of God, I wish you all the blessings of a joyful Easter season. So let's start our program tonight with music, since in Dostoevsky's words that we chose as the motto of one of our main areas of interest, beauty will save the world. Let's welcome Chris Vath at the piano and David Hahn Marks at the violin. Thank you very much, Chris and David. That was truly wonderful. And now, let's listen to 3 witnesses from 3 very close friends of Monsignor Albacete, and also friends of ours. You'll find their bios here in the program. Michael Sean Winters, Dr. Robert Pollack, and Helen Whitney. And by the way, there's books in the back. Dr. Pollack and his wife, I think, wrote a book together, and you can get their book in the back. And also, Helen Whitney is going to show a video after her witness. So now I invite Michael Sean Winters to take the podium.
I never would have agreed to this if I had known I had had to follow that. Talking about going from beauty to the beast. Wow. But I want to thank you for inviting me to this wonderful remembrance of our dear friend Monsignor Lorenzo. This was not an easy talk to write, in part because in his funeral homily, Cardinal Sean O'Malley took all the really good jokes and stories, and the ones he didn't use, I thought I used the best ones in my tribute to him at the time of his death in the National Catholic Reporter. But the harder reason was, of course, because the person I wanted to call on for assistance was, of course, Lorenzo. And I'm not sure if all of you have found this to be the case or not, but when I come up against an intellectual quandary, I feel Lorenzo's absence acutely. No one could get to the root of the matter with greater assurance and greater delight. But when I find myself facing a spiritual quandary, I feel Lorenzo's presence in some ways more palpably than when he was alive. You may recall he was not always the best at returning phone calls. But now when I'm praying, I feel he picks up the phone every time. I met Lorenzo in 1992. A friend, the Polish journalist Anna Husarska, who I had met with Rick Hertzberg, who is here tonight, was writing an article about the Pope for Vanity Fair and asked if there was anyone in Washington whom she should interview. I told her that I knew of, but had not yet met, a certain Monsignor who was rumored to be close to the Pope, and his name was Monsignor Albacete. Anna arranged the interview, and as she explained it later, fell in love with Lorenzo on the spot. I should note that Anna is not a Catholic, not even a believer. She said he was smart and hilarious and irreverent and all the things we in polite cosmopolitan society must celebrate. She went to Sarajevo on another assignment shortly thereafter, and upon her return, and in conjunction with the Feast of the Archangels, I threw a dinner party and invited Lorenzo. This was a time in my life when I would throw 5 or 6 course dinners for 8 or so people, changing wines with each course, which among other things assured about 3 hours at table with boisterous conversations. It goes without saying that Lorenzo completely charmed us all. I too, like Anna, fell in love at first sight. A couple of days later, I received in the mail a typed note from Lorenzo. I have saved it all these years, and I'd like to share it with you. Dear Mike, just a note to thank you for the invitation to greet Anna upon her return from Sarajevo and to celebrate your feast day with your friends. I really had a wonderful time last night, more perhaps than you can imagine. As I said, my involvement with the Pope and my assignment to his Institute for the Study of Marriage and the Family has put me in frequent contact with people whose ethos is the opposite of mine. Jacques Maritain once wrote that one is born conservative or liberal, or at any rate, it is something one can hardly control, since it is a matter of the heart. The thing to do, he said, is to train your intellect to become familiar with the opposite side in order to some way guide your heart's direction. I have a very liberal, almost radical heart. Therefore, I have tried to understand the concerns of those who are not like me. Following this path, I came to the conclusion that I could not accept all the positions that came out of the liberal hearts of my closest friends. This was way back in the late 60s and early 70s. Unfortunately, many of my friends decided I had somehow sold out and eventually gave up on me. Since then, I think I have gone beyond those categories in what I guess observers would call a more mystical direction. Alas, another misunderstanding, but I suppose less painful than coward or traitor or opportunist, all hurled at me at one time or another. Your cariñosa acogida last night, therefore, made me feel that I have not gone crazy, that my heart is still in the same place, and for a moment, I actually forgot my age. Anyway, I thank God for the circumstances that led to our meeting and look forward to enjoying a friendship in the time ahead. Please convey my gratitude to all your friends. They were a great company. I shall pray for you, Michael, especially to Our Lady. You are a good man indeed. Well, he was not entirely right about that last point. Sometimes I'm not good at all. But this letter showed me something I had not seen at the dinner. Lorenzo had suffered, been ostracized even, for his faithfulness to both his own heart and to the gospel. Later, he would be made to suffer by the machinations of prominent churchmen too. I noted above that he had displayed at dinner those personal attributes that appeal in cosmopolitan society, but suffering lacks all appeal in that realm. Here was not only charm and intelligence and wit and a brilliant sense of humor. Here was a mark of holiness and authentic humility. Quote, "No one can be truly holy without suffering," close quote, Cordelia explains to Charles Ryder in Brideshead Revisited. Lorenzo suffered in many ways. Yet, has any one of us ever known someone who more fully lived out the joy of the gospel? Over the years, I also came to realize that while he possessed in abundance those qualities of personality that we associate with cosmopolitanism, his urbane wit, voracious and comprehending familiarity with literature, and ease in conversation, these were not cultivated by him for their own sake. He had no intrinsic desire to be cosmopolitan. Instead, these gifts were cultivated out of that same faithfulness to his heart and to the gospel. He was obviously and thoroughly a believer. But he was also obvious and thorough in his love for life. He loved literature because it is human. He loved laughter because it is human. He loved conversation because it is human. And he loved all that was human more deeply than most humanists because of his belief in the incarnation. And he loved the incarnate Lord more than most Catholics because he truly loved what is human. One cannot understand this quality of Lorenzo's evangelization without understanding something about Puerto Rico. His faith was brought to him first and foremost by his mother, but that faith was nurtured in a culture and in a place where faith is carried as if on the trade winds that perpetually caress the island. Puerto Ricans take enormous pride in the natural beauty of their island home. They devote enormous amounts of time and energy to their familial and social life, and no one can understand Lorenzo without grasping his incredible devotion to both his mother and his brother. Puerto Ricans are a happy people. They grasp life in sacramental, relational understandings, not in our Anglo-transactional consumerist mentality. I do not think we can understand Lorenzo's own happinesses in life without understanding how it took root first in his native soil. I was with Lorenzo on 8 different occasions on the island. First for his mother's funeral, 5 times during his tenure as president of the Catholic University in Ponce, for our dear friend Roberto's installation as Archbishop of San Juan, and one other time when we just simply happened to both be on the island at the same time. So many memories. I think my favorite was at Roberto's installation. My job was to walk behind Lorenzo in the midday sun as we processed up the steep streets of Old San Juan on Calle Cristo from the Cathedral to Bayaha for the installation mass. Lorenzo was in his Monsignor's cassock. You have never seen so much watered silk in your life. And his surplice, and it was 1,000,000 degrees, and my job was to walk alongside him with a towel and bottles of water and to call 911 if he didn't make it. I remember sitting in a restaurant south of Mayaguez, looking out at the ocean, talking about his plans for the university, which did not come to pass. He was only there for 9 months. And again, there was some strange circumstances, but it was mostly clerical jealousy that drove him out. He called it, it was the reign of Lorenzo the Brief. I remember and have a photograph of us standing outside the Bombonera, which is the most dive of a restaurant in Old San Juan, and of course, therefore, his favorite. And we're both smoking and plotting, like hiding behind like papers. I remember going for a swim with Lorenzo and his friend Magda in a mangrove cay off the coast of the fishing village La Paguera. It was during that swim that he explained it was for just such times that he had been born by God's providence into a family with the name Albacete, which means white whale. Our shared love for the island was mixed into the cement of our friendship. This sacramental understanding of life, though, was founded fundamentally on the words of St. Paul to the Colossians. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or authorities, all were created through him and for him. For Lorenzo, these words were supremely true and real. Lorenzo's allergy to attempts at apologetics that tried to cut the faith into bite-sized pieces. His hostility to any understanding of faith is primarily moralistic. Most of all, any reduction of the faith to morals. These flowed from his keen awareness that such attempts missed the heart of the matter and hindered the encounter with Christ, and that we should not be afraid to proclaim the outrageous claims about Christ and the cosmos that our faith entails, and that all successful evangelization must be rooted in the primordial proclamation that the crucified lives and all creation is ordered to him. The histrionics about our supposedly endangered religious liberty was to Lorenzo even worse, a reduction of faith not only to morals, but to legalisms. I recall commiserating with Lorenzo after a bishop we both knew used his installation homily to give a vigorous defense of the First Amendment. I said to Lorenzo on the phone, he did not preach Christ and him crucified. He preached James Madison and him justified. Lorenzo howled in laughter. Lorenzo rightly disdained any efforts to make faith conform to worldly categories. That was one leg of his evangelistic genius. The other leg, indeed the antidote to the reduction of faith to worldly categories, was accompaniment, an immersion in the world as a disciple. Lorenzo was a great pastor of souls because he was never shocked by anything we humans did. He almost took delight in our foibles, seeing them as potential sources of conversion and grace. He dismissed nothing authentically human. Let me give you an example. Like George W. Bush, when I was young and irresponsible, I was young and irresponsible. I remember attending Mardi Gras in New Orleans one year. Better to say I remember some parts of attending Mardi Gras. Much of it remains a blur. But I remember that one morning, having not made it back to my hotel all night, I went to a park by the side of the Great River, lit a cigarette, phoned Lorenzo, and I said to him, Lorenzo, my fear of overcommitment did not come up. He howled. He did not reproach. He knew that God was active in my life, even when I chose to ignore it. Time and grace would suffice. In his book, God at the Ritz, Lorenzo wrote these words, in our relationship with the one who suffers, we as co-sufferers can impose nothing on the other person. We can only help the other person to ask the question why, by asking it together. That is, by praying together. Praying together with the one who suffers is the just response to the suffering. The cruelest response to suffering is the attempt to explain it away, to tell the one who suffers, this is why this is happening. I'm sorry you can't see the answer, but it's clear to me. When the apostles saw a man born blind, for example, they asked Jesus whether it was due to his sins or his parents' sins. Jesus rejected this explanation. He does not suffer because of his sins or his parents' sins. He suffers to manifest God's glory. To look for an answer in the past is to reduce suffering to a functional mentality. The functional mentality explains everything in terms of past causes. This does not do justice to the one who suffers. I call this the secularization of suffering, the elimination of its link with transcendence. For Job's so-called friends, Job's suffering was an occasion to construct their theology rather than an opportunity to express their love. They would not walk with him, co-suffer with him, pray with him for grace. Instead, they fit Job's suffering into a theological system that explained everything away. Close quote. It goes without saying that Lorenzo was never offered a fellowship from the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He recognized in them the work of Job's friends and had no use for the neo-Puritanism of the Catholic Rite. But in these words, I think we can discern one of the reasons he was so fascinated by and devoted to the man who would say the church must be a field hospital, Pope Francis. One of Lorenzo's favorite quotes from Emmanuel Mounier could well serve as a motto for this pontificate. It is necessary to suffer so that the truth not be crystallized in doctrine, but be born from the flesh. Lorenzo loved Pope Francis Ever since his election, whenever we would speak on the phone and the conversation would turn to this new pontificate, Lorenzo would say, "Mike, isn't it amazing?" This was his highest compliment. Lorenzo, again like Francis, also had no use for attempts of the Catholic left to make Christianity intellectually respectable. How horrified he would have been had he lived to see the publication of Daniel Maguire's latest tome, entitled, I kid you not, Christianity Without God, Moving Beyond the Dogmas and Retrieving the Epic Moral Narrative. Can you imagine Lorenzo confronting that book? God save us from the moralism of the left as much as from the moralism of the right. In his own book, Lorenzo addressed the dogmatic claim at the heart of our faith, and what he wrote there seems especially important for us to hear tonight. He wrote, "A woman once asked me if, quote, resurrection of the body, close quote, was a metaphor. That explanation satisfies many people. As a result, Easter doesn't embarrass them. Understanding the resurrection of the body as a metaphor seems a civilized, moderate, reasonable position that heads off some unseemly conflicts with Christians holding other interpretations. One can, as it were, say, oh yes, I believe in the resurrection of the body, without revealing exactly what kind of resurrection one is speaking about. What interests me here is this woman's question, is the resurrection of the body a metaphor? And the suggestion that, as a metaphor, that resurrection somehow corresponds to our experience of what is possible. My immediate reaction to the question was to think about and to notice and feel my own body, which could be diplomatically said to have reached threatening dimensions. I remembered how when I tried to get up in the morning, I discovered parts of my body because they hurt that I didn't even know were there. So in response to this question about resurrection of the body as metaphor, I replied, my experience of the body is not the experience of a metaphor. The day this baby becomes a metaphor, I'll be better equipped to answer your question. This wasn't exactly St. Paul's argument for the possibility of a bodily resurrection, but my questioner understood what I meant, he writes. I could tell because she laughed uncontrollably. I mean, this was in Southern California, where you see many bodies that make you think of the resurrection as a worthwhile thing, as a metaphor for their beauty and for their attraction. But alas, farther away from Hollywood, this is not always the case. What I would like it to mean, what my heart wants, is the real possibility of having a body like those who at that very moment could be seen around the pole during the shooting of an episode of some television series. I have no idea what my risen body might be like, but if such a thing does exist, I want it to be closer to the bodies at the pool than to a metaphor." Close quote. Everything I loved most about Lorenzo was in that quote. The quality he shared with Flannery O'Connor of turning an urbane explanation of the faith on its head. The ability to point out why our belief actually corresponds to our experience. The self-deprecating humor that permitted him to poke fun at the rest of us too. I do not know if Lorenzo is now in heaven with a body like Channing Tatum's. I do know that his ability to speak and write in a way that passage epitomizes brought me, and many of us here tonight, closer to a deeper encounter with the Master. Most of all, Lorenzo had an ability to tell a story or make a conversation in which he repeated a phrase from Scripture so that the person listening could hear that phrase as if it had just been spoken for the first time. In thinking about what to say tonight and of what he would want us to say, what he would want me to say to all of you, I was looking at his videos and in his book for an example of this particular ability to tell a story in which the words of Scripture are cast in a new light. For this is what real faith requires and evidences the ability to encounter the Master in word and sacrament and in our daily experience as new, fresh, revolutionary, making demands but also promising the Lord's abiding grace. I came across several examples, but then one day when I was walking my St. Bernard Ambrose, I could almost hear Lorenzo's voice in my head, employing a phrase from Scripture that seemed appropriate for this evening, and which exemplified his ability to make the words of Scripture come alive as words freshly spoken. What I could hear him say was this: look at all of you, sitting around with your memories, trolling around for what? For wisdom? For consolation? Why do you seek the living amongst the dead? Thank you.
Well, thanks, Michael. The first thing to say tonight is thank you. Thank you all for the chance to remember Lorenzo with you. Thank you especially, Angelo, Olivetta, and Maria Teresa, for your kindness to Amy and to me, and for our friendship over the years. It's a friendship that includes Lorenzo as if he was still with us. The first thing to say about Lorenzo tonight is that he was not nice. Nice people do not offend. Nice people do not speak the truth unless it's in their interest. Nice people know how to say no nicely. Not Lorenzo. Lorenzo could offend. Lorenzo spoke the truth even when it was detrimental to his own personal situation. Lorenzo could say no only with great difficulty, but when he did, it was never said nicely. The next thing to say about Lorenzo, or Monsignor Lorenzo Albacete, is that he was a member of my family for more than 20 years. This order of things is important. He could be a member of my family for many other reasons, but we would never have known that unless he was, like me, not nice. I can hear him now. Bob, what are you talking about? How can you and I be members of the same family? Don't exaggerate. But of course, we could be in the same family because the biology of a family and the idea of a family are very different. Only niceness on his part or mine could have prevented us from enjoying the remarkable similarity of our ideas. This is itself one of those ideas we shared. The idea that ideas are not limited to expressions of the way nature actually works. How can this be? Because ideas are not inherited. Again, I hear Lorenzo. Come on, Bob, enough. We're both scientists. We know that we're part of nature. So how can anything about us not be part of the information encoded in our genes? It's a great question. It really stops me. It makes me think again about my own science, the molecular biology and the history of DNA-based life. But my reply to him then is my memorial to him now. We both knew, as you all must know and as we must struggle to accept as part of the residue of fact left by the scientific method of testing disprovable ideas, that nature itself has no intentionality, has no perfection, has no ultimate predictability, and especially has no measure of good or bad, right or wrong. But we also both knew, and I hope you all know this as well, that nothing is more important than that difference between right and wrong, except perhaps preserving our freedom to choose to act according to that difference, for better or worse. More than that, Lorenzo and I both knew from our shared sacred text of Genesis, Bereshit, that to have this capacity to distinguish right from wrong while being ourselves the products of nature puts us in a form of exile while we are in the natural world. So back to my conversations with Lorenzo. We were brothers. The word brother, I say, has two meanings, and it is essential to elaborate on that distinction before I can say anything more about Lorenzo. There is the brother who carries a similar but distinct version of DNA from the same parents as one does. And there is the brother who carries a similar but distinct version of the mental world one has. These populations of brothers can be different because the mental world is not encoded in the chromosomes of the fertilized egg that becomes a person. These chromosomes encode about 10 or 20,000 different machines and bricks called proteins. These proteins assemble themselves and each other into the physical structure of a person. We are each mostly made of water, some salt, and the majority of the rest is a bag of proteins with DNA that encodes the proteins running a distant third in amount, if not importance. From the beginning of the modern era of DNA sequencing, it was clear that there was a problem with our DNA, and Lorenzo and I talked about this a great deal. The sum of the sequences of DNA needed to encode all these proteins that make us up was much, much less than the total amount of DNA in our chromosomes, no more than 1 or 2%. So what was the other 98% of the DNA doing? It was initially called junk DNA. This label summarized what was known about it. It had no known use, but there it was. That it was like the junk we keep around without any use, not the garbage we throw away. Today it's become clear, and I wish I could say this to Lorenzo, I miss him terribly as I say this to you all. It's become clear that most, if not all, of the 98% of the DNA, which makes us related biologically, has survived natural selection not by being junk, but by being the circuitry of gene expression. Some of that circuitry plays out as the emergence of hundreds of different tissues from the cells descended of a single fertilized egg cell, so that each of us is a human being and not just a ball of about 1 billion identical cells. I think of Lorenzo in that great gown as I say that. But the preponderance of the circuitry of gene expression has a social function. Come on, Bob, I hear Lorenzo. Social? Give me a break. And if he were here, he would smile and even laugh his special laugh, seeing my face fall as I dug inside myself to find the courage to argue back on such a weird idea. But yes, our DNA encodes in each of us the construction of a body and a brain, both capable of experiencing the world and of storing experiences as memories and as feelings. Some of these are held in language, but some are not. The way our DNA does this is through allowing experience of one or another sort to tune and retune circuits of gene regulation in our bodies and in our brains. These circuits, which are the main function of that 98% of our DNA that doesn't encode the physical structure, these circuits need not only interact inside our bodies, they can also require social interaction to be played, in the same way that a musical instrument requires a musician. Each of us is in this way the musician for the regulatory circuitry of feeling and memory in all the people who know us. By the same token, that is the golden rule of molecular biology, all of those people who know us play our DNA by their actions and by their inactions, as the expression of our genes changes in order to construct a memory or a feeling. So, to be clear, Lorenzo and I had no common ancestor, although we can be quite sure that going back far enough, we were both descended from the African humans who left for Europe, Asia, and the Americas between 60,000 and 10,000 years ago. Like everyone else here tonight, we are both American Africans. But we were also brothers because our circuitries were so similar. Even before we met, we had spent our time on rituals of communal prayer and on caring for other people. Most deeply, we had each separately discovered how much we could learn from people whom society at large had discarded as of no utility. The difficult, damaged, dying people we both knew were our most profound teachers. Though my science is still in its infancy, I will make the prediction in Lorenzo's memory that in time we will be able to understand the underlying similarities in experience-based gene regulatory circuitry that Lorenzo and I had shared, despite our lack of initial common biological ancestry. One further thought and then a poem. In my tradition, the world took 6 days to be created, and then it enjoyed its first day of rest, its first Sabbath. From that one until today, it had been a gift and an honor to observe the return of the seventh day, and in my observance, this has meant that colleagues and students know I will not read email nor do work on a Saturday. From sundown Friday to sundown Saturday is a time set aside for communal prayer and contemplation of that unnatural notion of telling right from wrong, good from bad, and then choosing inside that distinction how to act and when to be silent. So I'm here right now to finally thank Lorenzo for this gift of spending the last hours of this Sabbath with you, doing precisely that in his honor, as the sun goes down and the new week begins. Now for the poem. I suppose W.H. Auden is as far from Lorenzo and from me as any guy could be in ancestral terms. But as a poet, he writes in the language and the voice that Lorenzo and I share. On the eve of World War II, on September 1st, 1939, he wrote this poem just around the time that Lorenzo and I began our own journeys in this world. September 1, 1939, by Auden. I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. Accurate scholarship can unearth the whole offense from Luther until now that has driven a culture mad. Find what occurred at Linz, what huge imago made a psychopathic God. I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. Exiled Thucydides knew all that a speech can say about democracy and what dictators do. The elderly rubbish they talk to an apathetic grave, analyzed all in his book, The Enlightenment Driven Away, the habit-forming pain, mismanagement, and grief. We must suffer them all again. Into this neutral air, where blind skyscrapers use their full height to proclaim the strength of collective man, each language pours its vain, competitive excuse. But who can live for long in an euphoric dream? Out of the mirror they stare, imperialism's face and the international wrong. Faces along the bar cling to their average day. The lights must never go out. The music must always play. All the conventions conspire to make this fort assume the furniture of home, lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood. Children afraid of the night, who have never been happy nor good. The windiest militant trash important persons shout is not so crude as our wish. What Mad Nijinsky wrote about Diaghilev is true of the normal heart, for the error bred in the bone of each woman and each man craves what it cannot have, not universal love, but to be loved alone. From the conservative dark into the ethical life, the dense commuters come, repeating their morning vow. I will be true to the wife. I'll concentrate more on my work. And helpless governors wake to resume their compulsory game. Who can release them now? Who can reach the dead? Who can speak for the dumb? All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the remote romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street, and the lie of authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them, of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. So I will close with that and ask that we all pray in our different ways to hold on to the affirming flame by which Lorenzo continues to light our way. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pollack. And now, Helen Whitney.
So many eyeglasses. Well, thank you, Simonetta, and everybody at Crossroads for including me in this wonderful evening. I met Monsignor Lorenzo Albacete almost 20 years ago. Can everybody hear me? Better now? Better. I met Lorenzo almost 20 years ago, and the memory is still vivid. For it was, and I use an overused phrase, life-changing. It was a particularly fraught period in my life. I had spent 4 frustrating months doing research on John Paul II for a Frontline documentary, and I was on the verge of pulling out. To his admirers, the Pope was God. To his detractors, the evil one. The man who emerged was a caricature. I'd been talking to Michael Winters about my difficulties, and he said, Helen, wait, just call my friend Monsignor Albacete before you make up your mind. I couldn't imagine what the Monsignor could say to me to keep me from walking, but I called Lorenzo nonetheless. 3 hours later, we were still on the phone, laughing, talking, moving from the sublime to the ridiculous, from the personal to the metaphysical, from the best Italian food in the West Village to the complexities and contradictions of John Paul II. By the end of the conversation, I was back in the film, and for the next 3 years, I traveled the world in search of Lorenzo's Pope. And of course, Lorenzo's Pope of John Paul II was like no other. It was richly layered, complicated, filled with telling the tale. It recognized darkness as well as light. Lorenzo used to say to me with delight about the Pope, the man is a tower of contradictions, Helen. It was a portrait that said as much about Lorenzo as it did about the Pope. Why? Because Lorenzo reveled in complexity, in nuance, in shadow, in irreverence, and above all, in contradiction. And it is in these elements, he believed, and through these elements, that make us all so intensely human. Lorenzo met Carlo Wojtyła when he was cardinal and visiting Lorenzo's parish in 1974. Lorenzo became the future Pope's driver, his raconteur, his companion. I love imagining the two of them tooling around in Lorenzo's dilapidated, messy car, filled on the driver's side with ancient coffee cups and crumpled maps. I can see Lorenzo gesturing, his hands flying off the steering wheel as the cardinal trying not to be alarmed by the honking and the near misses. They are talking nonstop phenomenology at breakfast, Polish politics for dinner. I wish I could have been an invisible presence, or better yet, watched them with my camera. Cardinal Wojtyła then returned to Poland and wrote Lorenzo, hoping to keep the new friendship alive. But among Lorenzo's many gifts, returning letters, as Michael said, promptly was not among them. So years passed, and the the cardinal became pope, and then summoned Lorenzo to the Vatican. Lorenzo found himself, as he described this to me, walking down a very long, resplendent Vatican corridor towards the Pope, who was backlit, bathed in blinding light. In the strangeness of the moment, Lorenzo said, "I don't know what to say to you." And he heard John Paul II laugh and reply, "Lorenzo, did I have to become Pope to get you to answer my letters?" So my friendship with Lorenzo began with the Pope, and since then it seemed that we never stopped talking about everything. Our childhoods, our ambitions, my divorce, his tense relationship to Cardinal Egan, his love for his brother and mine for my daughter, church politics and world politics, my struggles with faith, and his ability to make me doubt my doubt, arguably his greatest gift to me. We traveled to Boston together and hung out in the screening rooms at WGBH. We went to California on the press tours. And of all our places to hang out, the Ritz-Carlton in Los Angeles was Lorenzo's favorite. He especially loved room service, unlimited for 3 days. We would hole up together, ordering our favorite comfort foods, watching movies, talking, and then descend to the lobby where Lorenzo would hold court and have yet another meal. His room service bill was legendary, as was his wit, his waist, and his insight. I remember how delighted he was when he chose the title, God at the Ritz, for his book. And it really, truly was based on the many sermons he gave to the enthralled journalists. So many stories, so many conversations. Here's another one. On the eve of Dennis Potter's death, the BBC presented an extraordinary interview with this great English writer. I invited 80-odd people, including Lorenzo, to come to screen the interview at my apartment. Potter was a sentimental, not a brittle, new atheist, and he was facing death without religious consolation or complaint. He was also expressing an avidity towards life and grief over losing the ability to write about it. In fact, he refused all morphine so he could write to the very end. There was a stunned silence when the 90-minute interview came to a finish. We all knew that the vibrant, charismatic Dennis Potter would die a few hours after the interview. A Catholic friend asked Lorenzo to speak, for she was yearning for comfort, as many of us were. And if we felt Lorenzo, the only cleric in the room, was going to throw us an easy sop, we were wrong. It is impossible to paraphrase his eloquence, but basically he said, "I cannot offer you comfort because I need comfort. Yes, death is an outrage. Why? Because we will never know this remarkable man. He is gone. I want to sit quietly with this reality for a while and not soften it. Later on in the evening, I can talk about my belief in the life to come, in the reality of resurrection, a stupendous claim, I know, but one I believe, but not now." People stayed for hours afterwards. My daughter was there that evening as well. Lorenzo found a comfortable position on the couch, surrounded by the young and the old, the committed atheists, the devoted believers, the searchers, and the agnostics. They were rapt as he expounded on what he called the great mystery. Lorenzo never tried to make Christianity's claims palatable, and when pressed to do so, he would frequently invoke Flannery O'Connor's famous retort about the Eucharist: "If it's a symbol, then to hell with it." In 2008, I was struggling once again with a decision to make a film, this time about forgiveness. It was a big, baggy sock of a subject, a vast idea without boundaries, geographical or intellectual. I wandered around in a daze, undecided. Late one night, I called Lorenzo, we're both sort of fellow insomniacs. "Help," I said, "can we talk?" A few hours later, he had identified the defining idea of the film and allayed my fears. We spoke for hours that night, but it was these words that I remember most clearly and wrote down. The thirst for forgiveness, Helen, is fundamental. It is an expression of the fear of nothingness. It is what death is. It means the incapacity to establish a relationship or to have anyone else establish a relationship with you. It's nothingness. Religions attempt to deal with it. But this ache, this primordial ache for forgiveness, precedes all religious expressions of it and ways of dealing with it. I felt that I was known by Lorenzo in a way one is rarely known in this busy, bustling world that can be also inattentive and occasionally unfeeling. Without him here to reassure me, I do fear that our separation now is final. But I can almost hear him inside me saying, as he so often did, Helen, death is not the final word. The essential point of this religion I have given my life to is that it has narrowed the mystery to one man in history. This is the original scandal. Our Savior is a failed Palestinian wandering around the Palestinian countryside, and I want him, not abstractions, not theology, to be with me when I die. And I believe he was. I hope, of course, that Lorenzo will be the second person I see when my time comes. Until then, I am grateful, so grateful that I have my memories and these precious moments of him on film, which I've assembled and that we will now screen. Thank you.
At the end of this millennium, the question of faith should have died. Faith has never been so assaulted as it has been in our time. He knows we are a people numbed by evil, seduced by false reason, overwhelmed by science. That even so, our yearning remains. To the Pope, science and the wonder it evokes in us is not an obstacle to belief, but a privileged path to it. John Paul II urges us to look beyond our intellectual atheism, because reason, which limits man to the visible world, will kill faith. Our yearning for God in whatever form, in the ocean or in the swell of music, suggests that we already have more faith than we know. But the ache is only a first step, but would ask us to open ourselves to a more wrenching experience. For some, suffering is the crucible where real faith is born. For others, suffering is where believing ends.
I think I learnt about sanctity when I went to Ethiopia in '84, '85. And I saw people whose lives are profoundly religious, who never take a breath without consecrating it to God or Our Lady or someone, for whom every day has a place on the liturgical calendar. To see these people coping with the huge humiliation of famine, because I think people who are not farmers don't realize that famine is the ultimate failure for a farmer. It's an utter humiliation and bestialization. But these people, under this pressure, behaved like angels. I mean, to me, they really were, you know, garbed in celestial light. It's hard to think of it without rage against God, you see, because they were his fools. I mean, that's what happened there. Those people followed their religious ritual into the worst kind of squalor you can imagine. so that the bodies were always beautifully washed. They were beautifully clad in the people's last white cotton garments, and they were laid in their shelf tombs as if they were precious things to rise again on the last day. And if you don't believe that there's a last day, or that they'll rise, or that there's any recompense for these lives of unremitting self-denial, then you cannot, I mean, if God exists, I'm against him.
This is what he would say to someone whose experience of suffering has become an obsessive question. You know, he would say, no, I have no consolation. My urge is, don't be afraid, continue questioning. Take the question as far as it goes. Let it become a cry. Let it become a cry. If it is a cry of hatred, a cry of rebellion, a cry of rejection, then say that cry. Say it, because you are this step away from faith. For the Pope, this is not the last moment in the lives of those victims. United with Christ, those will rise again. Life will be stronger than death. This is for the Pope as a conviction as certain as that the fact that the sun will rise tomorrow. He has placed faith at the center of the agenda. In the end, though, he knows that all he has been sent to do is to put the issue before us, to make the proposal with the urgency of every fiber of his being. Believe, do not be afraid to believe, his very first words as a pope. Do not be afraid. It will take nothing from you, but in the end it can only be a proposal. The greatness and the mystery is our freedom. We can accept it, we can move on to something else. I don't think he knows what will be the case.
Throughout time, religion has been a source of grace and consolation, and also of violence and divisiveness. Since September 11th, many are asking with urgency and even anger, how can such things be done in the name of God?
From the first moment, I looked into that horror on September 11th. Into that fireball, into that explosion of horror. I knew it. I knew it before anything was said about those who did it or why, I recognize an old companion. I recognize religion. Look, I am a priest over 30 years. Religion is my life, it's my vocation, it's my existence. I give my life for it. I hope to have the courage. Therefore, I know it. And I know and recognize that day that the same force, energy, sense, instinct, whatever, passion, because religion can be a passion, the same passion that motivates religious people to do great things is the same one that day brought all that destruction. When they said that the people who did it in the name of God, I was not in the slightest bit surprised. It only confirmed what I knew. I recognized it. I recognized this thirst, this demand for the absolute. Because if you don't hang on to the unchanging, to the absolute, to that which cannot disappear, you might disappear. I recognize that this thirst for the never-ending, the permanent, the oneness of all things, this intolerance or fear of diversity, that which is different. These are characteristics of religion. And I knew that that force could take you to do great things, but I knew that there was no greater and more destructive force on the surface of this earth than the religious passion.
One of the most impossible and memorable images of that day were people leaping out of the windows, being forced out by the fire behind them, driving them, herding them out the windows, and to see that image of two people, co-workers, strangers. I had no idea, but that not knowing made it all the more poignant for reaching out for somebody's hand to take your last step, that you would end your life in the hands of a stranger, plummeting thousands of feet to your death.
I think that the power of that image is it doesn't give an answer. It takes us in two opposing directions. On the one hand, we are all alone at the end. Life is fleeting. There's no one to help us when we face the abyss. And there wasn't. No one came for them. And on the other hand, they reached for each other. They said that in that moment when they're facing the absolute ultimate, there are other human beings to reach out, to be there, to help them, to help us.
To me, it just seemed the bleakest possible image of the whole thing. I couldn't find a scrap of hope in it. What I saw was utter desperation, jumping to certain death rather than dying in pain in a fire. It spoke to me of sheer panic, humans brought to the sort of furthest edge of despair. I found no hope in that at all. If there is a God, he's a very indifferent God.
A couple leaped from the South Tower, hand in hand. They reached for each other, and their hands met, and they jumped. I try to whisper prayers for the sudden dead and the harrowed families of the dead and the screaming souls of the murderers, but I keep coming back to his hand and her hand, nestled in each other with such extraordinary, ordinary, naked love. It's the most powerful prayer I can imagine, the most eloquent, the most graceful. It's everything we're capable of against horror and loss and tragedy. It's what makes me believe that we're not fools to believe in God. It's to believe that human beings have greatness and holiness within them like seeds that open only under great fire. To believe that who we are persists past what we were. To believe against evil evidence hourly that love is why we are here.
To me, that image is an inescapable provocation. This gesture, this holding of hands in the midst of that horror, it embodies what September 11 was all about. The image confronts us with a need to make a judgment, a choice. Does it show the ultimate hopelessness of human attempts to survive the power of hatred and of death? Or is it an affirmation of a greatness within our humanity itself that somehow shines in the midst of that darkness and contains the hint of a possibility, a power greater than death itself? Which of the two? It's a choice. It's the choice of September 11.
Choice is at the heart of all our actions. For civil war and genocide to take place, ultimately it is the individual who commits atrocities. Horrors that stun the mind. They take us to the very limits of comprehension and forgiveness. And yet, in the resonant words of John Paul II, forgiveness can purify memory. It can travel through time and history, breathing life into the killing fields, into the collective soul of nations, into the lives of its brutalized citizens. No less than any nation, the country of an anguished heart also cries out to forgive and to be forgiven. Personal betrayal can cut as deeply as a machete. Forgiveness can offer hope to these intimate woundings of the soul. So, in the end, forgiveness begins and ends with one person facing another. Friends, strangers, a mother and a child, a father and a son, husband and wife. The decision to forgive or not, a choice at the heart of our shared humanity.
We are made for relationships. Forgiveness emerges as the need to re-establish a broken relationship, without which we cannot live. The search for forgiveness is the search for a healing of an ache of the human heart.
It is the memory of lost possibilities. It is the enormous presence of absence. It is an ache for what could have been and is no more.
In fact, the religious notion of hell, what is it? Hell is absolute loneliness. It is the break of all relationships. It means the incapacity to establish a relationship or to have anyone establish a relationship with you. It is, but death is nothingness. So the thirst for forgiveness is that fundamental. It is an expression of the fear of nothingness. The religions attempt to deal with it, but this ache, this primordial ache, precedes all religions' expressions of it and ways of dealing with it.
Okay, my name is Angelo Sala. I'm one of the co-founder of Crossroads, and we want to continue the dialogue with men and women of our time, welcoming, appreciating, feeling present in our human experiences as we learn from Monsignor for so many years, and as we have just seen in a beautiful video put together by Ellen. And therefore, I'm really thrilled to announce that we have established an annual Albacete lecture on faith and culture. We would like that this moment every year could be a moment of hope, friendship, and love as we experience this year. Now, Chris, for the last piece.
That wasn't really being used next year.
Thank you, Chris, David, for the beautiful music, very moving, powerful. Thank you to each one of our speakers. I'm really in awe at how Monsignor has gathered together such wonderful, gifted people to share with us your knowledge, your talents, the love that you have in your heart. And I really hope that we'll see you all again at the Albacete lecture next year, and hopefully even before then. We're here because we love a person. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. Please take home your free copy of What's Faith Got to Do with It on your chairs, and also the spring calendar of events for Crossroads. We still have some more wonderful events coming up. Our next one is on May 13th, and that is going to be at the Crossroads Auditorium here downtown. It's a photography exhibition by Letizia Morini, who's a 23-year-old woman who has Down syndrome. So we hope that you'll be able to make it to that event. So I actually have to say one more thing. The person that rarely gets much credit at all, but who does everything, is Angelo Sala, who usually is all the way in the back, but today he's sitting in the front. So I just want to say thank you very much to Angelo. Okay, that's enough. He said that's enough. So everybody have a good night. God bless you.